Good day. Today is Tuesday, 26th August 2025. I'm now properly back in London in my room. And, well, we're back to discussing today the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, or maybe perhaps, and more precisely, the great geopolitical conflict between the collective West and Russia. But, of course, it's now becoming increasingly clear that Russia is not just a solitary country. It is itself integrated or becoming increasingly integrated into a global system, the system which brings together many different countries in an extraordinary kaleidoscope of different organizations, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Union, various others as well. And of course, one of these, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is about to start its meeting in China, in Tianjin, where the Chinese President Xi Jinping will be the host. Now, this is a most interesting meeting because if we take our minds back a couple of months ago, to the meeting of the BRICS states in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, there was a lot of comment and surprise that two of the key members of BRICS, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, did not go to the meeting in Brazil. And I said at the time that Putin would not want to travel to Brazil, that doing so could potentially put him at serious risk, given that his aircraft would overfly the airspace either directly controlled by or close to airspace potentially controlled by various NATO countries. There was no guarantee based on past history that there would not be attempts made to bring down his plane, to force his plane to land. And of course, as we all know, Putin is the subject of an outstanding warrant by the International Criminal Court. So I thought it unlikely that Putin himself would want to go to Brazil. And I also thought that it made sense, given that Putin was not going, for the Chinese President Xi Jinping not to go also, given that this was a time when relations between China and India were under some strain, but seemed to be repairing after a friendly meeting between Modi and Xi in the previous year, in November 2024, in Kazan, during the BRICS meeting in Kazan. But giving Modi space made sense for China. It would enable him to play the leading role in the summit, and it will facilitate a future meeting between Modi and Xi, and it would also ensure that the business of the BRICS at the meeting in Rio was not interfered with or muddled by any tensions between India and China. Now, I still believe all of these things, but I'm also coming to the view that there was another reason why Putin and Xi stayed away from Rio, and why the meeting in Rio, though it did proceed with important matters and did take the process of setting up BRICS payment and financial and trading systems further, why this meeting received perhaps rather less emphasis than the previous meeting that had taken place in Kazan in November of the previous year. And that is that I now wonder whether the meeting in Rio was always seen by the Chinese, by the Russians, by the Indians and the Brazilians potentially as well, as a precursor to the really important meeting, the one that is going to start in Tianjin in China in a few days, where President Xi Jinping, of course, will be the host, and where Modi and Putin will also be attending, and I believe that Lula himself is also intending to go. So this is, in fact, the big meeting that is taking place. Work was done in Rio basically to prepare for this meeting, the one in China. Of course, technically, it is not a BRICS meeting, though I would not be surprised if within the umbrella of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, there was also a BRICS meeting, a informal BRICS meeting also arranged. But this is where we come back to this fascinating way in which the Chinese and the Russians, because to be clear, they are the main drivers, have been weaving their strategic partnership, building up their strategic partnership, and at the same time collecting a whole series of institutions, of organizations, of agencies around themselves in a way that basically they all dovetail with each other and all work to form what will ultimately be a single group. But this group meets regularly under different guises, even though ultimately the direction of travel is always the same. Now, I discussed this many years ago, about 10 years ago, in an article I wrote actually for the Duran, soon after the Duran was first published as a website. I pointed out that the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership was extremely unusual in that though it was clear that these two countries were developing an incredibly close, exceptionally close relationship with each other, one which might almost be consistent with an alliance. The Russians and the Chinese always denied the fact that this was the case, always emphasized that this was a strategic partnership, and perhaps in order to conceal the dynamism and energy that is coming from this strategic partnership, they were weaving, they were cloaking the strategic partnership within an extraordinary cloak of different organizations. BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, others as well. So this is what I think we're going to see in a few days in Beijing, in Tianjin. The Chinese hosting this meeting, the Indians and the Russians there. India has a vitally important strategic partnership with Russia. India has gone out of its way over the last few weeks since it came under pressure from the United States to start scaling down or ceasing its imports of Russian oil. India has gone out of its way to make clear that the relationship with Russia is fundamental for India and is not open to debate or negotiation. Russia has been saying the same. So even though China, Russia, perhaps the core countries, India is also vitally important. And I would say that for the Russians, the fact that India is a member of BRICS, is involved in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is party to all of these processes as well. The fact that India is there makes it easier for Russia to proceed to develop its relationship with China, because otherwise the relationship between China and Russia might become too unequal, and as is often the way with unequal partnerships, potentially unstable. So they're all going, the key figures are going to Tianjin, and they're going to be meeting. And we have had intense interactions between all of them over the last couple of days. So Putin has had a number of telephone calls with Modi, calls which have gone extremely well. Some of these calls, one of these calls was Putin briefing Modi about the fact that he was going to meet with Trump in Alaska. The second call was Putin briefing Modi about what he had discussed with Trump in Alaska. But it's likely that they, of course, in fact, we know for a fact that they talked about many other things too. And of course, Putin and the Russians have recently received the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, and Mr. Doval, Modi's national security advisor, in Moscow. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been in India and has had a very successful meeting with Jaishankar as well. And there appears to be a process of détente underway between India and China. And Putin has had at least one conversation that we know about with Xi Jinping. Interestingly, the Kremlin has never confirmed that Putin and Xi actually spoke with each other following the meeting in Alaska. They did speak before the meeting in Alaska. But it looks as if Putin is going to brief Xi in detail, in person, in Tianjin, about what happened in Alaska. And of course, doing so in person has certain advantages. It means that Xi Jinping can ask Putin questions. The discussion can go much more in depth. There can be more clarity on various points. But it also means that there is no risk at all of anybody listening in on the call. I say that, I am sure that the Russians and the Chinese have long since sorted out secure phone lines with each other, but you never know. There's always a risk that somebody might be listening in. The National Security Agency has immense skills, as we all know, and of course there are spies and people like that. A meeting in which it's just Putin and Xi and the interpreters present, almost by definition, is going to be more secure. So there will be, no doubt, those sort of discussions between the Chinese and the Russian presidents as well. And I've been reading in both the Chinese and the Russian media about the various projects that the two countries, Russia and China, have with each other. More discussions about civil nuclear energy cooperation. More discussions about Power of Siberia 2, gas industry cooperation. The Chinese still want to invest in Russia's far north. We'll come to that in a moment. But most interestingly, I saw that the Russian industry minister, Mr. Alikhanov, has now been in touch with China, and he's actually been to China, and he visited a Chinese aerospace design company. And apparently the project to build a joint Chinese-Russian wide-bodied aircraft is back on track. This project had been heavily promoted by the Chinese and the Russians in the past. Then, after the start of the special military operation, the US and the Europeans imposed various sanctions, which made it more difficult for subcomponents which both the Chinese and the Russians at that time were importing from the West to be provided. It was then agreed that the two countries would go their separate ways, though they would maintain a contractual relationship with each other in terms of the development of this wide body. But the Chinese were anxious to proceed in a way that would not be affected by Western sanctions. But now, 3 years later, it seems that many of these problems have been resolved. Likely, both the Russians and the Chinese have moved forward developing various subcomponents of their own, and they no longer are as dependent on the Western powers as they used to be, including, I suspect, for avionics, which is one area where both the Chinese and the Russians at one time were heavily dependent upon the West. And so it's now becoming possible for the Chinese and the Russians to start working again towards combining their two projects. The Russians, by the way, just in parenthesis, also have a project to revive their Ilyushin 96 wide body, which was developed during the period of the Soviet Union and which is apparently still a modern and viable aircraft. It uses more advanced concepts than, say, the old Boeing 747 did. I suspect that the Russians, as they often do, will ride two horses at once, and it's not unlikely that the Chinese will do the same. The Russians might use, for example, the Ilyushin 96 for their very long-range flights to various places in the world. The Ilyushin 96 has an especially long range, and the Chinese-Russian wide-body, which is expected to have a shorter range, could be used more for internal flights, just saying. Anyway, there we are. Lots being prepared, lots being cooked up ahead of these meetings, and there will be discussions, obviously, about tariffs, about sanctions, about the threats from the United States against China and India to try to stop them buying Russian oil and energy products and all of those things. All of these leaders are going to be talking to a great extent about all of these matters when they meet together in Tianjin. Now, the German media today is reporting that over the last few weeks, Donald Trump has made 4 attempts to speak to Indian Prime Minister Modi. And Modi apparently has refused all calls. And the Indians are now becoming more forthright in saying that they are not prepared to stop buying Russian oil. This is not something that they're prepared to do. And there is an article today in the Financial Times by an Indian, I think he's an economist or oil industry specialist, and he makes the point that not only was India persuaded by the United States, or rather encouraged by the United States, by Janet Yellen in particular during the Biden period, to buy Russian oil in order to prevent oil prices from exploding. But if India did, in fact, stop buying Russian oil, if it started to compete for Middle East oil, oil prices almost certainly, in that case, would indeed explode. They would probably go well over $100 a barrel. And though that would be a disaster for India, and by the way, much of the global south, where, to repeat again, people have to live much closer to the margins of life than they do in the collective West. And, of course, higher energy costs, which immediately translate into higher costs for everything else, would be unbearable for many people across the global south. Well, it would be a disaster for India and for the other countries in the global south if oil prices were again to explode as they did in 2022. It would not be good for the collective West either, It would certainly not be good for the United States, and it's impossible to see how it would be good, politically speaking, for Donald Trump himself. Now, I make all of these points because over the last couple of days, I've been reading one article after another about the dismal situation in the Western economies. As I am making this program, there is a battle underway in the United States over the membership of the Federal Reserve Board. This has been a story that's been there in the background for several months. I've not covered it on these programs, and I don't propose to do so now. It is an internal matter, largely of the United States. I'm not going to discuss monetary policy in the United States in these programs. All I will say is this: the President of the United States wants the Federal Reserve Board to take a more relaxed approach to monetary policy. He is doing this for a variety of reasons. Firstly, no doubt he wants to kickstart the housing and construction industries, which have been largely moribund. He must also be worried about the cost to the US of financing the US's ever increasing debt load, which is, of course, more difficult to do when interest rates are as high as they are. So President Trump, it's understandable why he wants the Fed to lower interest rates. The Fed, however, or some of the more orthodox people there, like the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell, have been uneasy about doing that. They've seen that inflation continues to be sticky. It is above the Fed's 2% target. There are reasons to think that it might go higher, and fiscal policy is in some respects deteriorating. The big beautiful bill, as Dr. Jack Rasmus, the economist, has pointed out in several articles that he has written, has increased the size of America's budget deficit, indeed substantially increased the size of America's budget deficit. And at the same time as all of that is happening, the president's tariff policy, many believe, I believe, still has the strong prospect to add pressure on inflation. It could indeed cause inflation in the United States potentially to rise. Now, over the last couple of days, there's been a lot of discussion in the Western media, the financial media, about something called fiscal capture. This is the situation where governments, or rather where central banks, have no real option but to monetize the government's debt, because government debt is increasing so fast and the government cannot bring its budget, its fiscal budget, under control. And there's been suggestions that this has happened in the past, that it's led to hyperinflationary situations in the past. For example, in Germany in the 1920s, and by the way, a little known fact, also in the 1940s. And the United States also came very close to a period of fiscal capture where government spending was rising so fast that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, basically had to keep monetary policy very soft to accommodate government spending. It also happened in the 1940s in the United States, where the United States had to spend huge amounts of money basically to finance the Second World War and then to finance the transition of the US economy from military production to civilian production after the Second World War. It took approximately 5 years after the end of the Second World War for monetary policy in the United States to normalize. And there was, in fact, a formal agreement, I believe it was in 1951, between the Federal Reserve Board and the US Treasury, that monetary policy would indeed be normalized, and that from that point onwards, the Federal Reserve Board would focus more on inflation and on monetary conditions in the United States, and would no longer help the federal government with its deficit. And I'm going to suggest that there was a second period of effective fiscal capture in the United States after the Second World War. This was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the United States, as I've discussed in many programs, was seeking to fund the Vietnam War, which was resulting in a defense bill which in the late 1960s amounted to roughly 10% of US GDP. Anyway, the United States was having to fund the Vietnam War and fund the space program, which was extremely expensive, and also the Great Society program that was initiated by President Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s. And again, monetary policy was left too soft for too long. And again, as happened in the 1960s, in the 1940s, in the 1970s, the result was much higher inflation. So there are concerns that we could be heading into another period of fiscal capture in the United States, and of course in Europe, across Europe, as I discussed at length in my program yesterday, my shorter program yesterday. We are seeing many of these stresses play out also, only arguably to an even greater degree, because though the US retains a measure of economic dynamism, as commentators like Wolfgang Munchau, who's just written a good piece in Unheard, but he's also now a director, I believe, at a rather interesting new website called Eurointelligence, which is worth taking a look at. Anyway, as Wolfgang Munchau also points out, the European economy largely moribund. Its debt problems are growing. It's suffering from critical lack of investment, and there is no coherent plan anywhere within the European Union, or indeed in Britain, to address the underlying problems that are building up. And in his latest program in Unheard, latest article in Unheard, Wolfgang Munchau makes the point that though Germany, which does still have some fiscal space, could be spending money on R&D, on exploring and perhaps pioneering the new technologies, AI and all of that, looking for ways for long-term improvements to its otherwise stagnant and falling productivity. What it is instead doing is it's borrowing money at extraordinary speeds to do two things. One is to build more weapons, which it might not be able to do, by the way, because German industry is unlikely to be able to do that. And the other is to give money to Ukraine. 9 billion euros a year. Anyway, here it seems to me you see the contrast between the two worlds. One world, the one that's going to meet in Tianjin, full of energy, activity, governments making long-term plans to build civilian airliners, to develop new chips. There's an article that I've just read about a Chinese rival to NVIDIA, which is now also developing, for example, programs, plans to update and upgrade economies and to create financial and monetary and trade systems. And the other world, the world of the collective West, where we are flirting with what economists call fiscal capture in the United States, where there is struggles between the President and the Federal Reserve Board, where in Europe there are no economic policies at all. As Wolfgang Munchau pointed out just a few months ago, we had a long report from Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, all about how Europe should move forward to modernize its economy and deploy vast resources, investing in all kinds of things to improve Europe's otherwise dire productivity performance. Well, that was a few months ago. Nobody's talking about Draghi anymore. He, poor man, is apparently very offended about the fact. But his ideas, already all forgotten, all the money has to go on weapons and on Ukraine instead. No real coherent plans, no ideas about how to address the challenges of the future. Sometimes plans, even well thought out and well laid ones, don't come right. It could be that this is what's going to befall the leaders who are meeting in Tianjin. My own view, based on experience, is that those who do have a plan always, invariably, in the end, win out against those who don't. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say at the start of this program. I said at the beginning of the program that yes, we do have a conflict between the collective West and Russia, but this is a conflict that is playing out on a bigger geopolitical level, and you can see exactly how it is in fact playing out on that level at the moment. The meeting in Tianjin, like the previous meeting in Kazan, highlights the difference. Anyway, let's now turn to the underlying challenge, the conflict inside the greater conflict, the conflict that continues to play out in Ukraine. Now, in my program yesterday, I spoke about how Zelensky is ruling out all concessions. Now, I should have said, maybe I did say, that in fact he's made all of these comments about how Ukraine is entitled to every millimeter of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. It has an absolute right to join NATO. It has an absolute right to join the EU. Anybody who is resisting its attempts to join the EU or NATO is repeating Russian talking points, is working on Russia's behalf. I've perhaps neglected to mention that he's been saying all of these things during, over the course of the celebrations, if that is the right word, in Ukraine, of Ukraine's Independence Day. But, to repeat again, there is no sign, not a scintilla of a sign from Zelensky that he's prepared to make any substantive concessions at all in order to end the war. Now, it's been suggested that even if he did want to make such concessions, it would be very, very dangerous for him to do so, that there are also other people like a man called Sternenko, who is a prominent Ukrainian nationalist based in Odessa, with a rather disturbing history. He was apparently involved in the events in Odessa back in 2014, the ones that led to the tragedy at the trade union building. Anyway, Mr. Sternenko is quoted as saying that if Zelensky were to give any unconquered land away, he would be a corpse politically and then for real. It would be a bomb under our sovereignty. People would never accept it. And some are treating these words of Sternenko's as in effect a threat against Zelensky. Now, of course, it is a threat against Zelensky. I mean, the kind of language that Sternenko is using cannot be interpreted otherwise. And I said that this man has a history, and it's a history which makes it impossible to disregard these sort of threats that come when they come from him. But for the record, whilst I don't think Zelensky and his officials will disregard what Sternenko is saying, I don't think that he is the major reason why Zelensky is taking the hard line that he is taking. For one thing, I don't believe that Sternenko actually does have much influence in Ukrainian nationalist circles. Maybe he did back in 2014, but he has avoided direct participation in the war. That has apparently lost him a great deal of the support that he once had, and I understand that he's seen in Ukraine, including amongst Ukrainian nationalists, as something of a lone wolf. I believe that Zelensky refuses to make concessions, not just because he's under pressure from the nationalists to refuse all concessions, but because he doesn't want to make concessions. He has been playing the role of Ukraine's Churchill now for so long that I don't think he can play any other. I think that the idea of Zelensky meeting Putin and negotiating is simply an absurd one. And I don't understand why some people continue to think that this idea can work. I certainly don't believe that it can work. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Now, Zelensky himself is saying that it is the Russians who've been obstructive. He said he's apparently told the Americans that Ukraine is prepared to agree to an unconditional ceasefire and is prepared to agree to unconditional negotiations following that ceasefire. It doesn't seem to occur to him, by the way, that if he insists on a ceasefire before substantive negotiations can take place, then he is in effect imposing a condition for the negotiations. But never mind, let's not waste our time analysing Zelensky's illogic and inconsistencies. The fact is that nobody any longer in the West, I think, seriously imagines anymore that this position that Zelensky is taking is a sustainable one. Nobody believes that Ukraine can recover the territories it has lost in eastern Ukraine, or what was eastern Ukraine. Nobody believes that Ukraine can take Crimea back. So why do they continue to indulge him? Now, yesterday in my program, my fairly brief program, I discussed how suddenly there appears to be a renewed interest in General Zaluzhny, Ukraine's ambassador to London. And we have had this extraordinary article in The Guardian that tells us about how Zaluzhny supposedly refused a request from the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, for a call. By the way, I don't believe that story. I don't believe that the ambassador of Ukraine would refuse a call from the Vice President of the United States. I think it is inconceivable. It is possible that before agreeing to the call, Zaluzhny contacted Zelensky and the officials in Kiev and asked him whether he had their permission to make a call, and it may be that they told him that he didn't have that permission. But in that case, it wasn't Zaluzhny who refused the call. It would have been Zelensky and Yermak and the officials in Kiev, in effect, on his behalf. So already I have problems with this story. And we have other talk about this procession of people from Kiev and elsewhere turning up to the Ukrainian embassy in London, talking to Zaluzhny, trying to find some way to get Zaluzhny to re-enter the political arena to take on Zelensky and all of those things. Now, Zaluzhny is playing here a very, very duplicitous game, because it does seem as if he's letting himself become the object of all this speculation. He is presumably entertaining some visitors from Ukraine. And of course, he's not doing the one thing which, if he was truly loyal to Zelensky, he could do, which would end all this speculation and stop all those visits of people in Kiev to meet him in London. It would stop all of that at one go. He could come out and he could make a public statement and simply say that he's not interested in becoming president of Ukraine at this time. This is not part of his agenda at all. He is focused instead on his apparently not very onerous diplomatic duties in London. The fact that he doesn't do that he doesn't say anything like that, does suggest to me that he, by agreement with some people in the West, is clearly manoeuvring. Now, this is a very complex story. All sorts of pieces are moving along on this particular chessboard. And as is always the way when we're talking about intrigues in Kiev, trying to make sense of what is going on is impossible for any outsider firmly to do. Over the last couple of days, for example, we have had reports that a Ukrainian identified as Sergei K has been arrested in Italy on a warrant issued by Germany based on suspicions that he was involved in the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. This is the famous 6 guys, a woman, and a boat scenario for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. Just saying. Now, there's been speculation, or at least there's been reports in the past by the BBC amongst others, that the Ukrainian agents who supposedly carried out this attack on the Nord Stream pipelines, and it's perhaps important to say that as of this moment in time, nothing has been confirmed in any court of law, just to say. Anyway, there's been speculation that the Ukrainian agents were acting on Zaluzhny's instructions. Zaluzhny himself categorically denies this. But could it be that the reason for this arrest in Italy of a Ukrainian man who was traveling into Italy, but who is wanted on an outstanding warrant. That in a strange fact in itself, why would this person be travelling to Italy at this time? Was he sure that the warrant would not be enforced against him? If so, why was he so sure? Anyway, could it be that this man has been arrested following a tip-off from Kiev because somebody is trying to discredit General Zaluzhny and arresting a person who has previously been reported, perhaps by the BBC if my memory is right, as one of Zaluzhny's agents who carried out the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline, is a way to put Zaluzhny out of contention in terms of the battle, the struggle for the Ukrainian presidency. I mean, I just asked the question. There might be alternative explanations to this. I would say that from my own knowledge of Italy, the criminal justice system there is incredibly complicated, and somebody who's arrested in Italy under the criminal justice system, well, it can take years before they ever come to trial. I mean, at least that was the case when I knew more about it than perhaps I do today. Maybe things have been sorted out a little, though, to be frank, I would be surprised, personally, if that was the case. Anyway, could this arrest in Italy be connected in some way with these attempts over the last couple of days, weeks, if you go back to the Seymour Hersh article that appeared some weeks ago, these various attempts to promote General Zaluzhny as the putative or potential successor to President Zelensky. Now, I've already said, and I don't want to go over this again, that I believe that any attempt to remove Zelensky against his will and to set up Zaluzhny in his place would almost certainly destabilize the situation in Ukraine. The article in The Guardian, by the way, said that Zaluzhny himself worries about this and has informed some of the people who want him to act against Zelensky, that he's warned them about the enormous risks involved in doing this. But what I would quickly add, on the strength of this article in The Guardian, is that I do wonder why people believe, even if Zaluzhny does replace Zelensky, even if everything turns out right, even if his replacement of Zelensky is successful and he's able to consolidate his authority and is accepted as the new leader of Ukraine and there is no dissonance or trouble, why do they think that Zaluzhny is going to take any different line to the one that Zelensky is currently taking? Because on the strength of this article in The Guardian, he is not. He speaks in the article speaks of him about how he's going to project himself to the Ukrainians as the new Churchill, that he's going to promise them blood, sweat and tears in the struggle against the Russians, that he's going to actually intensify, not seek to end the war. Why does anybody think then that a person who has this stance, who has a long history of very close associations with the Ukrainian nationalist movement, who used to keep a picture of Stepan Bandera in his office, why does anybody in the West, J.D. Vance for example, believe that this man, whose qualities as a military commander, I also believe, by the way, have been greatly overrated. Why do they believe that he's going to make any difference? Isn't it likely that he will reproduce exactly the same policies and the same systems and structures as Zelensky has? I just asked this question. Perhaps others who know more about the situation than me can provide an explanation, because I certainly can't. Anyway, let's return to the whole situation in the West. There's been a very interesting article in Politico talking about the situation in Europe, and its title is low on sanctions ammo against Putin. EU pins hopes on Trump. Now, the article itself is a mess. It says all sorts of inconsistent and contradictory things. It also says things that are, well, perhaps wrong. For example, a lot of people in the West have homed in on the fact that the Russian authorities have recently imposed a ban on exports of gasoline. And this is often been linked by people in the West, and of course in Ukraine, to Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian refineries and other installations, parts of the Russian energy complex, oil and energy complex. Well, perhaps up to a point they are right, but I'm going to suggest probably to a much more limited extent than they perhaps believe, because as somebody who follows these things much more closely, who's followed very closely, tracked very closely Russian energy policies and industrial policies and those kind of things, and who I think it's fair to say has a more than fair track record in discussing them, I can remember many instances when the Russian authorities have in the past also imposed restrictions on energy exports in the past. They tend to do this when they want to create downward pressure on prices. Recently, underlying inflation in Russia has been falling rapidly. We have now had 5 weeks of deflation in Russia. And according to some estimates, the monthly growth of inflation, core inflation, or underlying inflation, is now running at around 3.5%. However, there are concerns that this is going to rise again in the autumn because of special factors affecting, for example, the cost of meat in the Russian food markets, but mostly because over the next couple of weeks, utility bills, utility tariffs, which in Russia are centralized, are set to increase also. Given that the central bank and the government are currently prioritizing on reducing inflation and are now talking about an inflation rate as an objective of between 6 and 7% on an annualized basis by the end of the year, given the likely jump in utility tariffs in Russia over the next few weeks, it makes complete sense for the Russian authorities to try to balance that out by, if only temporarily, holding down the price of gasoline. And in order to do that, of course, they need to ensure that there won't be a shortage of gasoline on the internal Russian markets. And that's probably the main reason, in my opinion, why they've imposed this export ban on gasoline. Perhaps some of the damage to the refineries by the Ukrainian drones has had an effect. But it seems to me that this is already consistent with general Russian macroeconomic policies at a time when the Russian government and the Russian authorities are seeking to bring down inflation. I just say this. So anyway, the Politico article brings up this topic about how Russian energy exports have been disrupted by the Ukrainian drone strikes. It's been a theme that people have been running with since at least the early summer of last year, by the way. But it does make a valid point, which is that the European Union has effectively exhausted its arsenal of sanctions. It's now sanctioned pretty much everything that it can in Russia. Arguably, logically, it really did this back in 2022. All of the various sanctions packages that we've had since then, how many dozen of them have there been? I can't remember. We're now talking about the 19th sanctions package that's coming. Anyway, all of these various sanctions packages have basically made minimal difference to Russian economic performance, certainly compared with the major sanctions which were imposed on Russia back in 2022. They cannot make much of a difference. And the next sanctions package, the 19th one, apparently, it is limited now to steps against Russia's so-called shadow fleet, which I've discussed many times, the ships that transport oil to various overseas customers from Russia and which don't do so in compliance with the G7 cap on Russian oil prices, a cap, by the way, which the United States is now apparently ignoring. Anyway, these ships that transport this oil, because they're not insured for their cargoes in London, they're classified as part of some kind of shadow fleet. In reality, they're just ships which transport cargo. There is an endless churn of these ships. Some engage in this trade, then stop doing so. Others take their place. Sanctions against these ships, or this so-called shadow fleet, is like trying to hit water with a hammer. All you will do is get yourself wet. It's not going to make any difference. It cannot stop the flow. It's a myth to think that mere sanctions are going to prevent it. Now, that's the European Union. So they have run out of what they can do. But all their hopes, apparently, are now fixed on trying to get Donald Trump to do that which I discussed earlier in the program, to do what Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal have been talking about, to impose those tariffs, those secondary sanctions on Russian oil exports. It's all the European Union has left. After that, the ammunition is exhausted. There is nothing more, nothing further that they can realistically do. Now, those leaders who are going to be meeting in Tianjin are undoubtedly going to be talking about this with each other. There's no conceivable way that India or China or any of these countries will refuse to import energy from Russia. Indian imports of Russian oil have apparently started to increase again. So we come back to this question. If this is all the Europeans have, then they need to understand that they actually have nothing. Because even if the Americans are reckless enough to impose these kind of sanctions and tariffs, it is not going to have the dramatic effect on Russian energy exports that they believe. Attempts to stop ships carrying Russian oil on the high seas, as some people have been talking about, or blockading the Baltic, is going to undoubtedly provoke a massive response and lead to an even bigger crisis. And of course, to the extent that these sanctions can achieve anything, the only effect will be that which I talked about earlier in this program, to push up energy prices. And the Russians will benefit because they will remain an oil exporter. They will probably more than make up the difference in any reductions in energy exports by the increase, the probably very large increase in the energy price. And since the Russians will almost certainly be providing discounts, countries around the world facing a potential oil shortage are going to scramble to buy Russian oil. This is probably, in some ways, going to play to the Russian advantage even more. And in the meantime, if tariffs are imposed against China and India, they will start to retaliate. India may have geostrategic options. It might pull out of the Quad, for example, which would be a major blow for the United States. The Quad being a kind of military structure through which the United States and other pro-American countries coordinate with India, essentially against China. And of course the Chinese can start to restrict even further their exports of rare earths, and Chinese finished goods will begin to run short very quickly on Western markets. Now, I ought to say that Gideon Rachman, an ardent supporter of Ukraine, has written a further article in the Financial Times about the advantage China has because of its effective monopoly on supplies of rare earths. So, what is the sense of doing all of this? I spoke about the stressed situation in Western economies, about the concerns about fiscal capture in the United States. I've spoken about the very bad situation in Europe. I've talked about the plunging realities in Germany. In France, by the way, there is a political crisis on top of an economic one. The French government is proposing a budget which envisages big, steep cuts in spending. The Parliament is preparing to reject it. The government is presenting this budget as a matter of confidence. If the budget is rejected, the government says it will stand down. President Macron has made clear that he does not want to call new parliamentary elections because he knows that if he did, Marine Le Pen's national rally would sweep the board. So we have a combined political and financial crisis developing in France. In Britain, as I've discussed in recent programs, and by the way, I should say, we've done a program talking about it further on the Duran. In Britain, we have concerns that the fiscal situation is becoming so bad that a financial crisis might start, forcing Britain to turn to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout, as it once did back in 1976. So, is this the kind of situation where you want to start another round in the economic war? Do you really want to make things so bad in the global economy at a time when your resources are already overstretched, at a time when you're already complaining, as Chancellor Merz has just done, that the welfare budgets in Germany are unsustainable? I understand that the same is now being said in the Netherlands also. Are you really going to create a massive crisis in the world economy, which inevitably is going to feed into a crisis in the global financial system, which is already in some places looking overextended and overstretched? And are you going to do it at the same time as the other side is meeting in Tianjin and is putting together a new financial and trading architecture as an alternative to yours? Well, I got to say it. I think that if you're talking about some of the people who write and talk and think about these things, if think is the right word, in Europe and the United States, well, I'd say that these people probably would want to do these things. They never sit down and think through the implications of what they're proposing. They go along in the meantime with everything that Zelensky does. Zelensky has Ukraine has just launched 3 attacks on the Druzhba pipeline. This is the pipeline that sends oil and gas from Russia to Hungary. Zelensky has not admitted that it was Ukraine that has attacked this pipeline, but he's effectively bragged about this. He's made jokes. He talks about how Hungary and Ukraine are the best of friends. He's given all kinds of warnings, coded warnings, that Hungary can expect further attacks on the pipeline unless it drops its complaints, its obstruction on Ukraine's EU membership bid. Hungary, for its part, by the way, has taken to pointedly reminding Ukraine that Ukraine receives 40% of its electricity imports from Hungary. Just to say. So anyway, is this the person you're going to support? Somebody who continues to vandalize the European energy system? We've just been talking about the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. If you accept the premise that Sergei K really was part of some plan by the Ukrainians, the 6 guys and a woman and a boat and all of that they really did blow up the Nord Stream pipelines, if you really accept that view, are you really going to go on giving them more and more money, giving them more and more support, engaging in further and deeper and more protracted economic wars, destabilizing your own global economy on behalf of these people? Well, the answer is probably yes, you can. I find all of this so astonishing, so difficult to understand, that if anybody had told me 5 years ago, say, that we would be in this situation where the West, the collective West, is putting its entire economic future and present, by the way, on the line on behalf of not just Ukraine, but certain political leaders in Ukraine who have conducted attacks on Europe's energy system, I would have said it was impossible. But there it is. That's where we are. Now, in the meantime, the war goes on. And I said yesterday that the fact that we're not getting much information from the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka front lines suggests strongly that fighting there is extremely intense, and we will probably get more news in a couple of days. And the overwhelming likelihood, is that when we get that news, we will learn that there's been a further major Russian breakthrough and success. There's very few reports, but there's more reports about how the Russians have cleared more ground around Konstantinovka, that they're apparently attacking a village called Stepanovka to the west of Konstantinovka, which, by the way, from my understanding, would bring the Russians not only closer to Konstantinovka from its western side, but also closer to the main supply road to Konstantinovka from Kramatorsk. Anyway, there are some reports about this. There are few reports from the Pokrovsk area. To the extent that we do have reports, they all seem to speak of further Russian advances in the area around Novoekonomichny, and of the Russians now fighting to capture this village of Shahove, which is also, of course, located northeast of Pokrovsk. I'm going to guess that in a couple of days' time, we will have clarity. We will discover, as I said, that the Russians have indeed captured significant territory in this area, and that Ukraine's military and operational crisis in this key battleground will have deepened significantly. Meanwhile, we are getting news from other places, and it is cumulatively disturbing for Ukraine. Ukrainian commentators are now increasingly talking about how Ukraine has now irrevocably lost the battle, the long struggle for control of the Serebyanka and Kremenaya forests north of Siversk and to the east of Liman. And of course that puts the Russians in a position where they could, in theory at least, advance south from these forests and encircle Pokrovsk entirely. A Ukrainian commentator finally acknowledged that Siversk, as he put it, is semi-encircled. Logically, this is the moment when Ukraine should retreat from Siversk. I said in my program yesterday that there are reports that the Ukrainians are now thinking finally of a retreat from Kupiansk. I would have thought that clearly Kupiansk is more urgent at the moment. There's already fighting going on inside the town. Apparently has been for some weeks. The supply lines are all being cut. There is still an exit point, but unless the opportunity is taken to withdraw through this exit soon, the exit point will close, and the Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk will find themselves definitely in a cauldron. And here we can speak of very, very large numbers of Russian troops, certainly outnumbering the Ukrainians, being in action. But we are close to that same point, it seems to me, with Siversk as well. We're some distance away. The Russians still have to capture at least two villages, Yampol and Dronivka, though they're now dangerously close to both of these villages. There are some villages that are still controlled by the Ukrainians, southwest of Siversk. But if you look at the map of where Siversk is, it's impossible for me to see how, with the fall of Serebianka, with the Russians now in control of the Serebianka and Kremenaya forests, with the Russians controlling Verkhokamyanska immediately to the east of Siversk, with the Russians holding positions south of Siversk as well, how it is going to be possible to hold on to Siversk for very long. In fact, if a disaster like the one the Ukrainians experienced last year is in Ugledar is to be avoided, logically, they should be pulling their troops out of Siversk now. Well, no sign that Zelensky is doing that. In earlier programs, I said that I expected that the situation in Siversk is now so bad that even Zelensky would see the logic of withdrawing from Siversk. Perhaps I spoke too soon. I have to say I've been reading more of his comments over the last couple of hours since I returned to London. I don't get the sense that he's prepared to withdraw from anywhere. He's not prepared to make any concessions. He's not prepared to retreat from a single millimetre of ground. He's not prepared to make any concessions at all. Now, I said at the start of this programme that it's always seemed to me that those who have a plan tend to win out over those who don't, that the leaders who are meeting in Tianjin, Xi, Modi, Putin and the others do have a plan on how to create a new financial and trading architecture, and that they're going to move ahead with it, and that this is the main purpose, ultimately, of the meeting in Tianjin. They will all, of course, celebrate, or some of them will celebrate, with the Chinese, China's victory over Japan, but this will be the main business that will be done over the course of these meetings. I also said that in the West, we see no comparable plan at all. The thing that most closely approximates to a plan is the plan that Donald Trump has spoken about using tariffs to protect American domestic industry in the hope that this would eventually lead to its regeneration. But I have to say that it's been long obvious to me that Trump's tariff policies have been captured by people with different objectives, and that they've now essentially merged with US sanctions policy, and they no longer have the economic logic that they once did. So, an economic plan on the one side, a absence of such plans on the other. And if we're talking about Ukraine, the conflict there, isn't the same true? The Russians clearly do have, and clearly are working towards an overall plan. They're clearly working towards, in accordance with some strategy. The strategy has involved attrition, wearing down the Ukrainian armed forces, gradually breaking the Ukrainian defences in Donbass, all preparatory to whatever further decisive move the Russians decide to take. And the Russians have a diplomatic strategy, and it is the one that Putin outlined on the 14th of June 2024 when he spoke to the Russian Foreign Ministry, and that is the plan that Putin outlined when he met Trump in Anchorage 10 or so days ago. So the Russians have a battle plan, and they have a diplomatic plan also. They also, by the way, have very carefully worked out economic plans too. the central bank, for example, raised interest rates last year to bring domestic inflation back under control. Domestic inflation is now back under control. The central bank, therefore, is soon going to be in a position to cut interest rates still further. What do we have in the West? We have the Europeans who have exhausted their sanctions arsenal. Politico says this. We have the Europeans agitating and badgering Donald Trump to impose tariffs and sanctions, further tariffs and sanctions, not just on the Russians, but on Russia's trading partners. Something which, if it is done, could create a global recession and a deepening in economic crisis and a collapse in production in the West and, well, a financial crisis in the West in its wake. And nothing else. And we have no diplomatic strategy. The European diplomatic strategy is to support Zelensky to the ultimate degree in his intransigence. We have no military strategy because nobody any longer seriously believes that the war in Ukraine can be won militarily against the Russians. There is some talk of replacing Zelensky with Zaluzhny, but I've already said that this isn't really a viable plan at all because though Zaluzhny himself seems up for that idea, were it to happen, it's far from obvious that anything would improve and far more likely that Ukraine would be destabilized. I do ask myself, I do wonder whether the leaders of Europe quite understand, the leaders of Europe and of Britain quite understand how bad and precarious their position has now become. Whether, as is sometimes the case, when people do find themselves in a no-win situation, that the only thinking that there is of a tactical nature, of getting through the day. All of this, of course, is entirely self-created. Alternatives do exist. Owen Matthews suggested about a week ago in the Daily Telegraph that it's long over time that the Europeans spoke to the Russians. It's a long over time that they had some frank and honest discussions with the Ukrainians. It's long over time that the Europeans finally admitted to their own people how bad the situation in Ukraine is, how the war cannot be won, how Europe cannot do more, and how the United States cannot do more either. But no, we do none of these things. We go on day by day as things around us just continue to get worse. Well, that finishes my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you, you can find our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.